Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the 21st Talks podcast. My name is Snell. Thank you so much for tuning in. This week, I had the chance to speak with S.J. Beard, who is a program manager and researcher at Cambridge's Center for the Study of Existential Risk. I had S.J. on about a month ago. S.J. is one of my absolute favorite people in the entire world to talk to. Potentially in the entire future of humanity as well, given the importance and weight of existential challenges we're facing this century. And I cannot thank SJ enough for coming on and for informing my approach to X risk so widely and so much. And today's discussion that we're bringing to you is no different. We talked about why people decide to do this work and ways of looking at existential risk work. You know, this fight to preserve and further a human future, like why people decide to do that. Because talking about things like artificial general intelligence and nuclear weapons and climate change and all these big issues facing us, let alone bio risk issues, talking about this stuff is really, really scary. And I am hoping to release some content in the future that talks about my early approach to these things. And it was very, very heavily filled with fear when I was younger. And it wasn't until I started encountering the ideas within existential risk and the community especially that I saw how many rational reasons there were, not for blind hope, but for realistic rationalism and realistic optimism, right? And that is, I think, what today's conversation really got the heart at. We talk about how ethics evolve over time and about a lot of the ethical background that helped to bring about this field of intellectuals and researchers and thinkers and some of the world's most wonderfully brilliant scientists coming together and going, hey, how can we make sure that we don't die this century? And how can we make sure that billions, if not trillions of future people can come about and actually live in the same universe that we are today and can have the same opportunities that for flourishing that we have today, while also democratizing the number of people who are actually able to live flourishing lives, right? So that's what existential risk is about. That's what effective altruism is about. It's about bringing about the most good that's possible. And that takes looking at the biggest, most scary, most challenging things staring us down head on. And it's understandable that a lot of folks who are engaged with that can see that as a very depressing enterprise. But it is deeply, deeply meaningful and is at the heart of my approach to life now. And that's because the meaning and joy and, absolute vibrant brilliance that, you feel when engaged in this field is just so high. It's so wonderful. It feels so meaningful. And it's critical to my meaning. And meaning motivates, as we say here at 21st Talks. So I hope that you find some meaning in today's conversation and not just some wonderful ideas from one of my favorite ethicists alive. And once again, thank you very much to SJ. And I hope you guys like, rate, and subscribe on this episode. It really helps us and our team out. And without any further ado, here's my conversation with S.J. Beard from Cambridge's Center for the Study of Existential Risk. Thank you all. I'll see you guys next week. In terms of moral psychology and moral decision making, which obviously is really really pertinent to the fields of effective altruism and existential risk, there's this concept, just for the audience at home, of the situation that you're in while making the decision seems to have a very, very strong amount of data supporting its influence, right? And this has been documented in studies I believe it was Batson's studies in the 80s and 90s on I forget what it's called. I think it's called it's some religious text the people were reading, and the question was essentially, if you have someone encounter ideas about being altruistic, and then have them be asked to spend a few minutes helping someone, does it change their behavior significantly if they are in a rush and are told to get their ass over to the next building for the next part of the study, or if they have a few minutes to spare? And what was found was that the time pressure was more of a significant factor in determining whether or not the people would stop in the Batson studies, in the Good Samaritan studies, than what they were reading. They could have been reading something on how altruistic someone was, i.e. the the Sermon of the Good Samaritan, or they were in the control group where they didn't read anything connected to being a Good Samaritan. And they found that people who were encountering and speaking these ideas of being a Good Samaritan were not any more likely to be one than were those who were not encountering those ideas, but just had a couple more minutes to spare. So human decision making within moral context seems to be very, very heavily dependent on situation. So I wanted to ask you about how that relates to the field of existential risk in regards to times in history where we saw institutions and situations that should have resulted in different behavior than they actually did.
Yeah, so I'm now going to answer a different part of this question, because one of the things that I've experienced from the effective altruism community, and kind of my experience of that, is the best argument I can give to someone as to why they should do effective altruist type activities, why they should give their money to existential risk mitigation, or to alleviating world hunger, or to alleviating animal suffering, actually isn't that this is what they should do. There are a lot of moral arguments, and I really like those moral arguments, and they form a big part of my day job. But the most motivating thing I can say is you could have this effect. You could alleviate a whole bunch of suffering. You can make a difference. Not that you should do this. And I think it's very often is the case that we are motivated by what we believe we can achieve much more than by what we think we ought to do.
Absolutely.
I have this thing I often say to people. So as an existential risk researcher, I often get asked, what are you most worried about? Or what do you think that I should be most worried about? And my stock response, which I still think is a really good one, is I don't want you to worry about any of these things, because worrying about them is not motivational. Worrying says, pull up the covers, it's just stressful. We don't want to deal with it. I would like you to be curious. I think we are living at an incredibly interesting time in human history. There are a lot of interesting things going on, and we have more power as a species than we ever had before, and than any other species in this planet's history has ever had before. And we have a lot of really interesting choices about what we do with that power. And I think being curious and asking the question about what we can achieve and what is possible, and maybe what definitely is not possible, what we are going to have to put up with, those are really interesting questions. And I think once you start to have an answer to those questions, the motivation comes very naturally. You don't need someone to say, so you could destroy all of humanity, or you could do this other thing. And destroying all of humanity is bad, so you should do this other thing. That second part of the sentence isn't necessary. And focusing too much on that, really gets in the way of motivating people. So, I think one of the things as an existential risk researcher we really need to do is to create other futures that people can envision and people can engage with and people can feel part of. Make sure that these are actually well suited to the purposes that we want to use them for. So they are actually going to reduce the risk. That I think is the big thing that existential risk research can help to do, because there are a lot of bad ideas about this that I think would actually do a lot more harm than good. So make sure that these are good features, and then just get them out there. And I think that is enough. But I'm also a moral philosopher, and I also care about moral philosophy. So I don't want to give up on it entirely, but I don't think its place is actually in the kind of the PR department. I think its place is actually much more prior to that, in terms of thinking for ourselves about what a good future is and what we kind of want to do this thinking about, what we want to show is possible or might be possible, not actually in persuading people to do it.
Can I ask, so pushing back a little bit, I'm curious in terms of sort of intellectual communication of the larger ambitions of the field. There is some portion of that, whether it's going on stage and lecturing about effective altruism or existential risk work to a specific demographic or whatnot. There's a certain point where you have to start breaking in to those moral questions and that technical moral philosophy. So I want to ask, what are sort of normative approaches to explaining effective altruism and X risk to folks? And it sounds like from what you've said so far that you don't think that normative explanation is typically worth giving, right? Is that, am I understanding you correctly there?
I don't think it's worth starting from the perspective that you need to get someone to adopt a particular normative point of view. And that's the first step.
Perfect. That's beautiful. Yeah, please go on.
So I do think we need to engage with people's normative views. And in particular, I think, at least within academia, there's a problem at the moment that certain people believe that existential risk is not for them because they believe that it has a certain set of normative commitments, that you have to be this kind of long-term utilitarian, or this, for whatever reason, this just isn't your cup of tea. This isn't the stuff that should be concerning you. So in so much as I'm engaged in kind of frontline moral philosophy at the moment, my main job is to try and deconstruct some of that and show that actually I think people with quite a wide range of normative points of view can and should care about human extinction, and for broadly the same reasons. But I actually see my goal less as persuading people to take up that position, as just showing them that that position is in fact completely compatible with whatever else they believe. So in particular, people who reject utilitarianism, who maybe adopt contractualism or deontology precisely because they know they don't want to accept some of the sort of the aspects of utilitarianism that they don't like, also believe that this means that they shouldn't care about existential risk. And I think that's a very fallacious point of view. And the onus is actually on them to show why human extinction is not also an incredibly important moral subject from a deontological or contractualist point of view.
And I specifically building off of that, because that is such a brilliant point. I really, really appreciate that. Gosh, I'm so like the SJ. It's so much fun chatting with you. I always have like so much fun. But specifically building off of that, recently, I've been really interested in thinking about existential risk work and effective altruism work, and viewing it as a form of care. Whether it's it can sound kind of hippy dippy at times and say like an act of love for like humanity, but I do think in its root essence, it is an expression of our best attempt at rationally caring for things that we deeply do value and do actually care about, in a way that is perhaps counter to some moral intuitions that have led us in the past and now are kind of being examined and redetermined through like equilibrium, right? But nonetheless, it's just I want to hear your take on this idea that X risk is a form of care, both for the world today and for future generations.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful idea, and it's definitely something I feel, this kind of visceral sense of love for humanity. And actually, it is not just about an abstract sense of value, and that's certainly how I always feel about it. I think one of the things I do think a lot about is that society has changed a huge amount in a short period of time. But actually, the amount of time that human beings have had to adapt to this change is actually less than you think. The reason being that you spend a large chunk of your life being socialized by your parents into the ways that were helpful or that they perceived to be helpful to them to engage with the world. And then you have a certain amount of time in which to kind of reflect on that and think about whether that's right or not, whether that's something that you agree with or not. And then if you're going to have children, if you're going to bring in the next generation, you then take on that role of actually socializing the next generation into whatever you thought was the right thing to do. So it's not actually the case that each of us, in my mind anyway, kind of gets 70 years to adjust to the changes that have happened in our lifetime. I think we're actually still really adjusting to the changes that happened in our parents and our grandparents' lifetimes that they didn't have enough time to figure out before having to pass that information on to us. And so we get a partial draft, and we come into it halfway through, and everyone's trying to do this all at the same time. But yeah, so for instance, roughly speaking, I reckon you get about 10 years between when I'll give another, just a brief example of this. I don't know if you've heard of this. Douglas Adams had this kind of argument that he said everything that happens before you're 15 is just kind of exactly how the world works. The internet came into my life when I was about 10 years old, and I cannot imagine a world without it. I try and remember that there was a time I was alive, that the World Wide Web didn't even exist. And there was a time when it existed, but I wasn't connected to it. But it's just always been the case for me that the internet has been around.
I think about that in terms of Minecraft and YouTube.
Yeah, exactly.
So, both very valid.
Or loads of things. But and then he says, everything that happens between when you're 15 and when you're about 30 is new and exciting and really important, and it's where you can probably build a career. And then everything that happens after you're 30 is a complete abomination and is very dangerous and really should never have been allowed to happen.
So there's a jaded curve to history of individuals.
But he's using that as comedy, and it's a really funny way of thinking about the world, and I think it's really true. But there actually is a deeper sense in this, which is, until we're 15, until we're 18 or 20 now, we get so much handed down to us, and we're told that this is how it is. And I think we have about 10 years on average, and each generation has had about 10 years at most to adjust to these new things that are coming along that we believe belong to us and are interesting and impactful, before we actually do set everything in our ways and start handing it on to the next generation. So if you think about the last 200 years, I don't actually think we've had 200 years in any of our kind of lineages. We haven't had 200 years of time that any individual could spend adjusting to that. I think we've had about 60 years of that. And all the rest of that time in my life, my parents' life, my grandparents' life, my great-grandparents' life, has been about just kind of taking what was given to them or passing on to the next generation. And then you kind of come out of the stream of life, and you're not impacting it and not trying to impact on it in the same way. Now, obviously, that kind of time is unequally distributed and so on, because it's not literally just 60 years when people have been adapting. But I don't think we really have got our minds around, the telegraph, or got our minds around that point in history when all of a sudden you could talk instantaneously, you could send a message instantaneously to anyone, anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
We still really do engage with people like they are right next to us, because for almost all of human history, that has been the only way that you can do this. And now, we're engaging with social media, and we've just had 18 months, 2 years of only really living our lives with these virtual messages and these long distance messages. And we have to do that, but we're not very good at it, because we're still really recovering from the shock of the telegraph and the postal service and all these other things. If you'd imagined one person living the last 200 years, I think they would have made decisions very differently to the way that we've had to do it, because all the decisions have to be taken intergenerationally and the information gets passed on.
Oh, that's absolutely fantastic.
So, I think in terms of this EA as care, I think a lot of this is saying, okay, let's step back from this and let's look at this from the long-term point of view, because we know that we are, as individuals, deeply entrenched in one particular context. But we also know that there's a lot more than that at stake here. And we need to consider a much wider range of information. And I think it makes sense that that's one way that we do this. We are kind of trying to help humanity to do some of the change that it needed to do, but that's actually really hard for us and really difficult. And that motivation and the reallocation of funding, I think, is a way that we can kind of accelerate and implement some of that change. But I do also think it is really hard for us, right? It's not like we have a magic bullet for escaping all of this stuff, but it's what we're trying to do. It's the goal.
Do you reckon? So I recognize that naturally where this is headed is towards a really lovely conversation on transhumanism and long-termism. So I'm curious, before we go there, just on this sort of branch of thought, do you reckon that catastrophes, right, historically the great unveiling, right, as like the ancient Greek word for apocalypse translates to, do you see those periods of crisis as a genuine potential reset, and therefore to be one of the reasons why within our or within our like storytelling traditions, times of disaster and catastrophe seem to like be really, really encapsulated in such a way that is more than just the material damage they cause. They seem to be a time of opportunity, right? And this isn't to say that disasters or existential threats are in any way therefore like more ethically valuable. No, it's like it's catastrophe. It's something that we have to work against, right? And that, you know, we have the ability to build a better future. Is really how I think you are saying it should be phrased. But nonetheless, like, yeah, what do you think of that notion that catastrophes, and how does it connect to this idea that you're talking about in terms of this generational lack of value reset and assessment?
Yeah. So catastrophe has, as you say, a lot of different meanings. And within this community, and we talk about global catastrophic risk, and it is seen as the largest amount of damage. And that's the kind of definition that catastrophe has in our culture. And that's absolutely right. But as you say, kind of, it didn't used to mean that. It used to mean just a sort of a great change. And that could be many different forms, you know. And I think that the sort of the emergence of electronics in our lives and what that did to human relationships was, in that older sense, a catastrophe. It didn't harm people, but it just greatly changed everything and how we had to relate to it. You know, the advent of AI is also going to be a catastrophe. It might not be a bad thing, but it will be a great destroyer of much that has gone before, and of many different ways of life, you know. And we really want to put this evaluation on top of it. But we have to remember that the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, you know, was it a good thing or a bad thing? I think any sensible individual needs to answer that question with, I don't know. It's way too early to say. We know that the agricultural revolution did a huge amount of harm. And
yeah, I mean,
think,
tooth decay. It's a great example.
It's really easy to make the case that it was a bad thing. It's also really easy to make the case that it was a good thing, right? I think at the moment there is a sort of intellectual trend to say, oh, that was definitely terrible. Like we should never have done that. You know, life in the Paleolithic was just fantastic. Like, actually, I don't think it was. I think it was incredibly different, and different in ways that probably transcend our ability to really evaluate these two things. But there were huge costs associated with agriculture. Whether those costs can really be said to have been matched by benefits, we still don't know yet. We're still probably at a stage now where it's up to us if we can find sustainable ways to, you know, carry on existing within Earth's biosphere with the technologies and the population that we currently have, or we can find ways to escape those limits. It may well be that cosmically it was a fantastic thing. I think if we don't, if, you know, society was to collapse at this point, I think there would be a big argument to say that what was the last 12,000 years for? What was the point of all of that? Actually, didn't we create a huge amount of human suffering and animal suffering for no real purpose?
Those bomb shelter ethicists will be quite the pessimistic lot.
Yeah, I think. But then, you know, I hope that they won't. I hope that they won't spend their time arguing over, oh, that was a waste of time. I hope they're going to think about what we should do next, right? How we could do it better next time. And to some extent, you know, this question about whether human history up to this point has been worthwhile, it's not a very useful question for us to ask. But it is still fascinating that it is not a question that we can really answer. And given how readily we do make moral judgments about things, it does feel like we should be able to answer this question. And if we want to make these sweeping moral judgments about future changes, and we know there will be catastrophes, we know they will be great bringers of change, but whether they will be for good or bad, it's really hard to say. So in some senses, maybe the older meaning of catastrophe is a more useful one. And yeah, it's really about how do we navigate these great changes that are happening right now and will happen in the future in ways that take account of what they mean to people, and that that are careful, that are wise, that are not. Well, at least we're not going to make any really obvious mistakes. Really, sort of, oh bummer, I really should have thought of that kind of mistakes. That seems to me like the more realistic aim to have here, rather than to say that we can know necessarily what is best.
Well, it seems it seems that in regards to this question of the sort of consequential trap sometimes of saying, well, the only way that we can assess the value of a situation or a decision is, ultimately can only be considered on data points that are farther ahead, right? And there's ways to mitigate this, right? There's like proximal or sort of the capped time variables you can use for like utilitarian judgments and all that stuff. But I think taking another approach towards this question of what existential threats and what these catastrophes, using the old world sort of termination or definition of the word catastrophe, like what these catastrophes can mean for humanity, specifically speaking to the people who will probably be listening to this podcast. I hope it's not just some 25th century like digital archaeologists coming back listening through it. I hope it's people in the 21st century right now. And for some reason, our audience doesn't skip this episode completely, right? But talking to these people who will be listening to this episode, I think what existential risks can mean is a form of individual sort of coming about, right? Viktor Frankl talks about suffering ceasing to be suffering as soon as it becomes meaningful. And I think that through working to build a better world, in some way, you're not only working on, in line with a lot of basic psychological human needs that, the literature on flourishing has really demonstrated to be accurate. I'm talking community, I'm talking a sense of purpose, I'm all these things, but you also in a more, Jungian sense or sort of psychological sense, are working to cultivate yourself in a direction, right, that can be really, really valuable. And this brings its own potential issues, right? Because obviously, if your sense of identity is wrapped up in the X-risk work you're doing, then the likelihood of you sticking to your guns in situations where you should really give them up, goes up, right? So there's definitely implications here that need to be thought out and articulated differently. However, the root sense of, by working on these catastrophes this century, I can figure out what it means to be alive today as me and as someone within my community and as someone just within the world. I can find my own values. I can assess what I actually care about through doing this work. I think that is a very, very wonderful idea that poses existential risk involvement, EA involvement in a way that is graspable for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure you get this, people say, oh, existential risk, that sounds like a really, gloomy field to be involved in. I hope you're
they
okay.
always say, oh, fun at parties, aren't you? And I go, actually, yeah, talking about X-risk at parties is a great time.
Because, I would know about the risks that we were facing, even if I wasn't in this community, even if I was doing something very different. I would still know. People do know, and they do worry. And I am pretty sure that there is nothing better that I could be doing than the work that I am actually doing. There isn't some better way that I could use my time. And actually, when you are dealing with risks that involve, huge amounts of death, destruction, the suffering, all of the other things, that's a real comfort. It's a real consolation that at least, you're trying.
Exactly. And this is something that is, I've tried to get across in a recent Q&A that I did for our patrons, because close friends have been like, why this thing? And it's I'm someone who tends to be very enthusiastic. I like to live life in a way that's affirmed, right? I was nihilistic for too long, and quickly realized that the cultural soup that I was being baked in was so heavily influenced by the forces of catastrophes, of potential catastrophes, of past cultural catastrophes, that, I had to uncover these. I had to think about these, right? And I'm talking about the death of meaning. I'm talking about, the historical decline of traditional routes to how people, had a sense of purpose. I'm talking about the decline of faith in institutions. And I'm also talking about like material like hazards like climate change. And it's something that young people today who predominantly make up our audience, it's something that there's a perspective shift, I feel, generationally, where we have been brought up in that world of climate change. Ever since I was youngest, I remember, and I've never talked to someone in the field about this, and it'd be interesting to see your reading on it, but it's quite funny. I got into X-Risk eventually. It's completely perplexed my family, because when I was a kid, all of my anxiety was directed at, oh my God, the world's going to end. Oh my God. And it was over the most it was over the most silly things at times as well, right? And there was this hyperfixation that was an expression of like anxiety or perhaps OCD or something that didn't resolve until I was 12, 13, 14, probably 15. And I remember before that point, it caused me to recognize the risks were there, but to skirt away their analysis, right? To not actually sit down and look at the facts, because I felt like I couldn't bear it. And as soon as I started to realize that, oh, I could actually bear it, and more importantly, by looking at the facts, you come into contact with the names of people who are doing research, who are highly accredited, who are highly brilliant, caring, wonderful human beings, and they are dedicating themselves to fixing this, right? And each one of those people you uncover is one rational reason for hope in this context, right? And that is worth so much more from a moral motivation standpoint than fear and fatalism will ever be. So 21st Talks is largely a podcast about like finding and sniffing out this strain of nihilism and pessimism that growing up under the weight of global catastrophes like climate change and the sort of cultural milieu of pessimism of our time that's so baked into youth culture today. I am actively trying to sniff those out, because that doesn't motivate. that strips from people's ability to take action.
So I agree with almost everything you say there. The one thing I push back against is the exceptionalism. I remember talking to my father about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he would have been, I think he was 14 at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he said, yeah, he remembers where he was when they were talking about the photos that showed that the nuclear missiles were on Cuba and addresses by Kennedy and so on. That almost everyone who is alive now has, at some point in growing up, had to deal with potential existential catastrophes. So, there were people in the 1940s who really got this. But yeah, I think the first time it was really kind of a global phenomenon was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that is such a big thing in, baby boomers' youths. Like, it was really big news, and people really feared that the world was ending. And then again, in the 1980s, and with Star Wars and with the nuclear winter hypothesis, again, kind of in Gen
Thanks,
X,
Carl Sagan.
It was a huge thing. There was a moment of real terror. And then I think, with millennials and again with Gen Z, it's got very much the same hallmark. So I think every generation for so long now has actually grown up under the pall of existential risk. I think what has changed a huge amount is people's ability to engage with it. So, in the 1960s, there was a big anti-nuclear movement, and people got very involved in it, and lots of young people did. And there was also this thing, the Committee of the 100, where there were people who, just like Extinction Rebellion today, they said, right, we're just going to go out and get arrested because that's the way to make publicity. So that was there, and there was kind of lobbying leaders, but there was this sense of this amorphous lump of power in the world, and all you could do was kind of assault it. But this power was very small number of people in very powerful positions, and they still had all this respect and so on. What has changed is, I think, two things. Firstly, we now don't view these risks as being so centralized. We now view them as much more dispersed, concerning all of us. And secondly, the way that we respond to these risks is now more coordinated. I think the emergence of a field that studies existential risk in the early 2000s is a very prominent thing. It's no longer just I'm concerned about this one thing, so I'm going to go and really shout about it. It's now actually you can go and study existential risk as a phenomenon and look up all sorts of ways that we can deal with it that aren't just about telling the powerful people not to do the bad things, but that, really kind of understand why this risk is there and what we can do to reduce it. And that creates all sort of opportunities that just weren't there in the past for people to make use of this. So you don't need to develop that shield of fatalism and cynicism that I think people had to in the past, because there just really wasn't much for them. There wasn't much that they could do.
Oh, that's brilliant. I guess 2 points as a response I really want to hear your take on. The first is I'm a big fan of the existential psychological work of Viktor Frankl, who I mentioned earlier, and in a recent translation that was just like it. Essentially, it was written, and it was a lecture he gave to college students, undergrads, I believe 11 months after he got released from a Nazi death camp, at the end of World War II. And he, in this lecture, he essentially says, I have the quote like always in front of me. He says, he's talking about the feeling of living in a post-war period. And he's saying that at that time, 11 months after World War II, they're living in some way in a typical post-war period. But quote, although I'm using a somewhat journalistic phrase here, the state of mind and the spiritual condition of an average person today is most acutely described as bombed out. And this alone would be bad enough, he notes. But he says, quote, by feeling that, or it is exacerbated by once again feeling that we are yet again living in a kind of pre-war period. The invention of the atomic bomb is feeding the fear of a catastrophe on a global scale, and a kind of apocalyptic end of the world mood has taken hold of the last part of the second millennium. And so he's talking about the birth of the atomic section, right? We're talking about, one of the big four is born in this, the public perception of it is born out in, at least for him, these 11 months in Central Europe, in the mind of a very acutely, very adept at perceptive, or a very adept and perceptive psychologist, right? And despite him rebuilding his life immediately after and doing what he could to find meaning once again, this sense of living in a pre-war period so soon after World War II, because of the invention of the atomic bomb, is already laying a sense of pessimism and doubt. And you're saying that based off of the ways that we can engage with existential risks today, despite the challenges of them being so decentralized, or in some ways decentralized, in other ways, absolutely not. Luke, if you're listening, that's not what I meant. I'm gonna get an angry email from Luke. So like you're saying that today there isn't the same. There may be the same perception, but the response can be wholeheartedly different.
Yeah.
Because of things like effective altruism and things like existential risk as a centralized field.
Definitely. I also think, and it kind of sends a shiver down my spine when you read that quote, because he's talking about the creation of the atomic bomb in the latter half of World War II. And he knows about that. He knows that risk has just entered the world.
Yeah.
He doesn't know about the other risks that have just come into existence, that we now look back and we can say, artificial intelligence had its birth at the same time and for the same purpose. And it wasn't long at all before Alan Turing, at least, was kind of arguing that, this technology will come to replace humanity, and like we should be really worried about that. And he doesn't get to do much with it. He comes out on the air and the BBC kind of just a few months before he gets arrested, and there's this terrible process that leads to his death. But sort of he's very aware of that and this technology and what it could mean. We've also, right up at the same time, we've had the kind of, firstly, the first serious biological weapons programs are instigated during the Second World War. And also we know that, in Cambridge, they are like, they're nearly there with the sequencing of DNA and understanding how we can manipulate life and all of this stuff, which leads to a huge explosion and all these kind of biological risks that we now have to deal with. And also the other thing that happens at exactly the same time is what this kind of this great acceleration. In the 30 years after World War II, the global population increases like never before. Industrial output increases, faster than it ever has in terms of sort of rate of change ever has, or quite likely ever will in the future. The pollutions increase, like the soil degradation increases. The way that we engage with the biosphere is completely transformed in a very short period of time, because people have just learned from the mobilization of World War II about what can be achieved. And they're just going to put those same industrial strategies to use in civilian contexts, and will completely revolutionize industrialization. Because throughout the 19th century and even the 20th century up to World War II, the economic growth is not that fast. We look back at it at this big revolution, but actually it wasn't. It was faster than it had ever been before, and there was a really steady increase. But actually, year-on-year change was not that great. It's in World War II, and it's taking these lessons of mobilization that have been learned and applying them in a peacetime context. That is actually the real industrial revolution our species had, and the way that kind of consumer culture reaches everyone in a really transformative way. So we can now look back at it and say, actually, that war that they've just been through, that has unleashed 4 different, what will turn out to be existential catastrophes. The big 4 have all come in at the same time, and basically for the same reason, because the Second World War gave people both the opportunity and the resource to work on more or less whatever they wanted to do, and to make massive progress in doing that. And that's going to change humanity forever. And we still haven't really got to grips with how to govern that, how to respond to that. So, yeah, I find that quote even more kind of spine-tingling and prophetic than you describe it. Moment, the echoes that it's still having for us.
I remember when I first read that, it's a translation by Daniel Coleman, and like I said, this is the first time it's been translated into English, and it was 2020 is when it was done. I'm hoping to get Coleman on the podcast soon. But Viktor Frankl has been incredibly influential in my ability to, the way that I see it personally is stamped to the call to action for existential risk work that comes from this internal desire to live a flourishing life, right? And I think that when I first read that, you got to see that. I'm going to have to send you a photo of the book, SJ, because my copy has I'm not exaggerating, at least 60 different pages marked. In just entire sheets of just scribbling, just all of my replies to it. And that note specifically, I remember when I read that, I had to put the book down and go on a walk for at least an hour and a half. It was absolutely ridiculous how powerful that was. And the way that I tend to think about it, and you're significantly more knowledgeable than I am about the history of existential risk. Although I'm hoping to get to your point of conception and reading on the topic one day. But it seems that World War I was the psychological blow to the sort of old mindset, right? And even from that, we're still recovering.
Yeah.
And this is true when we look at the course of the death of meaning, at least in the West, right? Which I'm not trying to centralize the conversation on. But from talking about the cultural or the sort of cultural history that I'm accustomed to firsthand here in the U.S., that's absolutely true. That's the same time when all of these massive cultural shifts that were expressed in part in art and stuff, but also in the work of Tolkien. I've been working on a piece for 21st Talks for some time now on the psychology of World War I and what it means for the 21st century, in terms of this sense that maybe progress isn't so good, which is a claim that I disagree with, right? But it's something that was baked into Tolkien's perspective because of the tragedies of World War I, because of the mechanization of World War I. And I think that we're still recovering from that. So no doubt we're still recovering from World War II, but that seems like it's more of a material realization and shift, right? That you're talking about.
Yeah. I think, I kind of want to say to that, yeah, World War I was a big psychological blow, but actually World War I happened the way it happened in part because people hadn't recovered from the Franco-Prussian War and the American War of American Civil War, right? Those
We're
were
going to
the
work
two,
our way all the way back.
those were the first two really mechanized wars. And then in the First World War, people were like, okay, we know that this mechanization can be incredibly tragic. So we're all just going to have to throw everything at it. And they do that because they got kind of caught on the hop with those two previous wars. But, those two wars very much affected by the French Revolution. And I don't know, like, there is a lot of, going back to the point I was making earlier about kind of how little time we've had to adapt. You were raised by someone who was raised by someone who was raised by someone who fought in the First World War and was recovering from that trauma. And they, were raised by someone who was raised by someone. And by this point, by the way, we've got 6 generations back. Now the people we're talking about, almost all of them are illiterate. Okay, that's another thing.
I was just going to say, they're going to be illiterate. Oh my gosh.
They're going to be illiterate. They're going to live without electricity. But, we as a species, we kind of go around collecting trauma. And we know,
we're really good at that.
From our own personal experience, every human alive sort of knows how that hangs around in families and how that affects people down the generations. We're really bad at scaling that up and appreciating what that means for humanity as a whole. And that we have gone through so much and we are recovering from so much. And I think that is a huge influence on a lot of things that you see in the world, that we need time. Each generation is really trying to deal with its own problems and the problems that were handed down to it. But I think for a good long time now, we have been handing down more problems than we solve. And that's it. I don't kind of want to sound like I'm saying that makes our job impossible, or even like we should feel really sorry for ourselves or anything. I just think it's a fact that we have to deal with, that these are the people who are trying to solve all of these problems. These are people who keep on having kind of more and more things handed down to them. And we are to some extent here trying to fight against that and trying to work out how we can turn the corner and make it so that, hopefully at some point, each generation we can be sure it's getting better and better. And I think we are making big improvements on that. So for instance, there are now very few children now who are being brought up with physical abuse, right? It's now really newsworthy when children suffer terrible physical abuse. That used to be completely normal. That was not at all newsworthy. Maybe it was newsworthy if someone wasn't beating their children on a regular basis, right? Wasn't kind of starving them if they were naughty, wasn't doing all of this stuff. Now we're getting rid of that. Like, we have got to a stage now where children who are sexually abused are sometimes believed. People often want to say, it's terrible, this stuff is happening. And it is terrible. It's completely terrible. But 30, 40 years ago, almost no children were ever believed because they were children. And if the adults disagreed with them, then the adults were telling the truth. Like, that's an amazing thing that we're kind of getting there. There's a bunch of things like that where things are improving. The number of children who are growing up hungry is reducing substantially. That's a really big thing. But it's going to take a long time for the healing effects of those interventions and those changes to really pass down, because you still have the case that people have had the experiences that their parents and their grandparents handed on to them. And at the same time, as I say, we are adding a whole bunch of new things onto the pile. So the long-term goal I would like is one where we're still moving, we're still, progressing as a species, but hopefully actually each generation is kind of being able to clear out more trauma than it adds. And I think there are definitely reasons to be hopeful and to say that we are making progress on that. But it's still a very substantial problem that we have to face. And it's going to be a long time until we kind of see a reduction in this sort of psychological debt that we've been building up for many generations now.
Brene Brown says trauma is either transformed or transferred. And I think that captures this view really closely. And it's also tricky because oftentimes the psychological effects of getting to a better place, either individually or communally, oftentimes has a empathy muting effect on individuals, right? Like we see this from people who come from like my economic background, right? Where as I become more successful, like I have certain built-in structures to try and anticipate the fact that statistically, I am like, if I climb the economic ladder, I'm likely to become less empathetic to the people who, were in my like working class neighborhood back home. Right. Yeah. And like, that's something that I need to avoid. And, you have to build, you have to entrench yourself in sort of like reminders to reconnect with those aspects of your history, because, I personally think it's really important for psychological well-being. Right. But also just for empathy cultivation. And I think that oftentimes, on this process of sort of like collected trauma over generations, and that sort of it's almost like a trauma fission, right? One little particle shoots into one particle of trauma, turns into another 8, and then it just like progressively gets cataclysmically worse and worse. And that is a force that, like you said, we are trying to work against, and that's an incredibly deeply consoling way of looking at X-risk work. And that's the reason why it's not unpleasant to talk about at dinner parties. Yeah. Because like, yeah,
I do have one problem with talking about it at dinner parties, and that's sometimes I feel like, and I think this is probably particularly because I'm a researcher at Cambridge studying this. It's like it is really intimidating. It's not depressing, but there is definitely a stage of like, I couldn't think about this. This is like,
it's like, yes, you can. You could totally think about it. Like,
I want you to. I want everything I do to be something that would be accessible and usable to everyone. But I think there's a lot of a kind of sense out there that most people's opinion on this doesn't matter or isn't important, and I wish it was otherwise.
Can I run an idea past you
Sure.
about this specific thing that I've been thinking about in terms of X-risk work specifically? So I with a good friend of mine, Nathaniel Cook, who's done research at Caesar. Yeah. Nathaniel and I started this like reading group for young people in the field who want community in their pursuit of existential risk, right? And it's been a tremendously fun time, but a lot of the critique from our group that we've ran into of these young people who are really passionate about X-risk and effective altruism is, well, I just wish there was a really straightforward explanation of each of these articles, right? And you can kind of get that on the EA forums. You can kind of get that from other places. And a part of this podcast mission is to talk to the experts who are publishing cutting edge research and hear from their perspective straight out. However, I think it'd be such a fun project to collect as many of the most significant papers in X-risk and EA, and just write like an extended, very, very accessible breakdown of all the findings and views, in part through working with the people. And I know the Caesar's PR does that to a certain extent, right? By having like breakdowns, but having a centralized place where it's just like a list of the articles and a really accessible breakdown that's marketed in a really nice, accessible way, that almost can get people to not realize they're reading a breakdown of a incredibly esteemed scholar at like Cambridge or Oxford, because it is intimidating, especially when you put that name on it, right? And I think that like it would be so much fun to do that as like a summer internship or something, right?
I mean, I do think there's probably a certain element of mis-selling here, because for me, one of the exciting things about doing something like this is I'm not having to break everything down so much. If I'm writing an academic paper, people kind of think of it about it's this big, monumental, complex thing, but actually it's not. A lot of writing a paper is about absolutely paring everything down to the bone and just giving it in the most kind of direct, technical description of what you're talking about. It is, this is the really simple, accessible version. That is what scientific writing is all about. It's much more fun to have a conversation where you're not trying to close everything off and make it all really simple and straightforward. And you're going to accept that some of the things we're talking about are quite complex and and tricky. And that's fine. And it's up to you, the listener, to make up your own interpretation of this and kind of play along with the game. I'm demanding a lot more of you in the conversation that we're having right now than I would if you went and read one of my papers. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that is actually what you want. So I think it's not so much about the simplification and representation of information. I think it's actually firstly about removing, as you say, that kind of intimidation, the language, the kind of stamp that gets put on things. But also it's about presenting in a way that people feel that it is okay to play along at home. You know, if you have a strong opinion about what we're saying, that's a really good thing. Whereas when you're reading a scientific paper, you feel like you're shut out from it. You feel like this is the truth, because that's what the language is aimed at. So I think it does sound like an exciting project, but I think it can go the wrong way. And I think you have to find a way of presenting them that makes it interesting and accessible, because it sounds like the sort of actually somewhat inconclusive and very deep conversations that we're used to having about this, not the actually quite simplified, precise, and usually very conclusive presentations that we offer within the scientific literature.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that's one of the reasons why specifically the approach that I'm really interested in EA and existential risk communication is sorry about that. But specifically the approach I'm really, really interested in is an interdisciplinary approach that doesn't only bring in people from tangentially connected communities that currently don't have bridges from X-Risk to them and their existing intellectual discussions in digital communities, but also that viscerally connects to things that people are already deeply passionate about. And there's a growing amount of online communities and intellectual discussions that have really high engagement about like AI or free will, or like these really big questions that previously were very intimidating for people, and in many ways still are, but are becoming more accessible. And I think a big part of that has been creators' abilities to connect these really big ideas to things that are graspable in people's day-to-day lives. And I think it's given me tremendous hope to see, how popular long-form podcasts have become that are with very technical experts, in part because it shows something that, I've suspected for quite a while, which is, people are smart, people are interested, people are curious, people want to be in the know. And I think making X-Risk more accessible emotionally through connecting it to things that people care about and putting it in terms that are real, that are accurate, and are also that are, as you're saying, gripping. I think is some of the best things I can do as someone who wants to communicate these things.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you coming on the podcast today. We're going to have to wrap up, but we didn't even get to like half the questions that I wanted to. So hopefully it'll be a third discussion we can have at some point in the future. But thank you so much, SJ.
Oh, that's great.